Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong, and I'm your host, Chad D. As you know, we have been using my platform to call out Alabama Power and the Public Service Commission, trying to get people to pay attention to the fact that we haven't had a real rate review in this state since 1982. And Alabama Power just posted record profits at $1.5 billion. That's with a B, billion. Our customers pay some of the highest electric bills in the entire country in the state of Alabama. And when people started making enough noise where it actually looked like something might change in the state, their first move wasn't to open their books, but it was to try to take away your vote. They pushed a bill to try to turn the Public Service Commission from an elected body into an appointed one. And when that blew up in their face and the backlash was bigger than they ever expected, they come back within weeks with a second bill. And still, it doesn't touch what you're paying. It has nothing to do with affordability. Now it gives the governor, like I said, appointment power over half the commission and installs an energy secretary who controls the agenda and answers to the new governor who will be elected later this year, not to you, the voter. Every single move has been about keeping their books closed. But here's what gives me hope. About 150 miles east of us in Georgia, where Southern Company also runs the show through Georgia Power, the people fought back, and in November of last year, the people won. For the first time in 25 years, Georgia flipped 2 Public Service Commission seats, and the man who won one of them built a career fighting Georgia Power before he ever even ran for anything. He went before that commission without pay for 6 years, making the case that the math didn't add up and that consumers were getting squeezed. Then he decided that testifying wasn't enough, and so he decided to run for the Public Service Commission. He beat a sitting Republican incumbent by 20 points. His name's Peter Hubbard. He is now sitting on the Georgia Public Service Commission. Georgia Power and Alabama Power are both Southern Company subsidiaries. Same parent company, same shareholders, same playbook. And Peter just beat that. And so, without further ado, I give you my conversation with Georgia Public Service Commissioner Peter Hubbard. Peter Hubbard, thank you so much for joining us on He's Not Wrong today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Chad. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So as you know, the audience has heard a bit about you before we got started in this conversation. But one thing that I really admire you for is jumping into the race in Georgia for the Public Service Commission last year and flipping a seat. I was following the news for those special elections and the elections in November and December religiously, and the Georgia Public Service Commission was not on my radar. When I saw that it flipped, I got so excited because it gave me hope that if it can happen in Georgia, it can happen here. I know it still is Republican control, but you flipped 2 seats, and that is something to be commended. So I'm just wondering, how did you get to that point to where you're like, yeah, you know what, I'm going to run for the Public Service Commission? What was that journey like leading up to that decision?
Yeah, it helps to give a bit of context. So I moved to Atlanta a decade ago. My wife worked at the CDC until we saw the writing on the wall, and she had to move jobs. But my career was as an energy consultant, putting together long-term power plans for utilities. And then after the Inflation Reduction Act, I became a solar and battery storage developer, and for 3 years worked on permitting and the interconnection and all of the efforts that it takes to build a successful solar and battery storage project. In the last 6 years, really since the 2019 Integrated Resource Plan in Georgia, with the skills as an energy consultant and developer, I formed a nonprofit and just started going down to the commission saying, hey, I've read the plan and I think we can do better. And I began in 2019 with some gentle comments, and they said, thank you very much, and moved right along. I came back in the next plan in 2022 and made a stronger case for moving to clean energy. And that would help with lower power bills and things of that nature, and with climate change. And that was politely discarded as well. And I did that 2 more times in the 23 IRP update and then the 25 IRP. And in all that time, it fell on deaf ears. And there was no election in Georgia because of how we elect our commissioners. We have to live in a district, but the whole state votes on you. And that's relevant for Alabama. By the way, you can't gerrymander the whole state, but you can gerrymander a district.
Yep.
And I threw my hat into the ring and ran for office last year. And I think really what resonated was that there had been a lack of accountability at that Public Service Commission. Bills had increased significantly. In fact, 6 times over 2 years, 39% increase on the average bill. And it was from poor decisions and to keep up with a profitability metric for the power company and other things of that nature. Not really related to data centers, these power increases. Those are yet to come. But all of that helped, I think, channel frustration with the public over a lack of accountability and an increase in a basic cost of living. Energy is fundamental to an economy and to everyone's pocketbooks. And when those costs go up, we feel it. Yeah. Just like we're feeling the pain as we drive by a gas station, fill up now. So all of those things drove me to run for office, and I saw it as a Moneyball opportunity. Not many people pay attention to the Public Service Commission, what it is or does. For the record, a Public Service Commission decides how much you pay on your power bill and where that energy comes from. And so that's my specialty. It's what I'm passionate about, and just took that to the to public office.
One complaint that a lot of people have in Alabama, for the people who've been involved for a really long time, is that when they go to these Public Service Commission meetings or they go to any kind of public hearing, very little is actually discussed. A lot of those decisions and discussions are happening behind closed doors. And I'm assuming that that was kind of the case in Georgia for a long time, because you continuously went to these Public Service Commission meetings. And for, I believe, over 6 years, you were showing up to these meetings. And in Alabama, I know a lot of people are getting turned off by the idea of being not well informed when they go to these meetings. And so they just quit showing up. But that's not something that you did. What did you see at these meetings that drove you to continue showing up for so long?
Yeah, I think it was actually two things. One was the frustration of asking to have a seat at the table, despite having some really great proven ideas, things that are being deployed around the world, and especially here in the United States with other utilities in other states. And I mean, just explicitly asking for a seat at the table and being told no, you're not. You're not going to be a part of the conversation. So that, I think, drove me to then run for office, and also just, I think, the ability to see with the background that I have, that there is very much a viable pathway to lower folks' energy bills and to clean up the environment, and to just have all these wins. Yep. Instead of just doing what we've always done, business as usual. And, I know that you can't change the ship of state overnight. I'm fond of saying that electricity travels at the speed of light, but you can't change things overnight. But, we have to start somewhere. And so I think both of those things, seeing the benefit not being picked up, and the frustration of not really having a voice, those two things brought me there and kept me coming to the Public Service Commission. And again, there wasn't an opportunity to run until last year, but I bided my time and just kept doing the work. And I think that truly benefited me when folks were trying to assess a no-name candidate. Yeah, for real. Well, they looked and saw that, yeah, he's been doing the work now for the last 6 years, the last 4 power plants, and he's put his analysis into the record and stands by it. And I still do. So I'm eager to be there at the commission. It will take some time and maybe a different composition of commissioners, but there's a lot of good work we can do. And we have to have someone to provide that thought leadership, which is what I'm beginning to do. And then also have the commissioners that can stand by that leadership. Yeah.
I think that's such a powerful thing when running for office, to point out, like, we need a seat at the table. It's so important that people make space for people that are not represented on elected bodies. And when I ran for Montgomery City Council in 2019, there were no young professionals who were represented on the Montgomery City Council. So I wanted to make that space. And I was a no-name candidate, but the fact that I was running a campaign about having a seat at the table, people paid attention. And it was exhilarating knowing that when people feel like they're represented and they're seen, they have something to cling on to, they're getting involved and they're learning. That's a great thing. You being that, as you say, no-name candidate, you're running against Keisha Waits, and you had to go into a runoff, and you beat her and she was a fairly well-known name in the state, being a former state lawmaker. How competitive that runoff was, and you winning that, what did that inform you about going on into the election in November?
The primary was really just there were four candidates, in fact, to begin with, and I made it through the end. That was really just about accountability, and it did teach me. I think having to go through a primary runoff into a general election, and now having to do it again, a general election this year, it just honed my skills and allowed me to sharpen the message.
Yeah.
And very helpful going into the general when I had to go up against the incumbent Republican who was an appointee and had not actually been elected before. And so I think it was very helpful. By that time, I was very comfortable with debating and I invited the incumbent to come and debate, but he didn't show up. And so I think it played out very well and was helpful for me to go through so many different primary election, primary runoff, and then a general election. That it just helped hone the skills.
Yeah. Wait, walk me through your campaign, because I feel like you hear about campaigns that are going up against big entities like a power corporation, and you think there's just a lot of money being funneled into it. But when you look at the campaign finance for the Public Service Commission races in Georgia, it actually wasn't that much that was spent, raised or spent. So I'm just wondering, what did that campaign actually look like on the ground to be able to become the success that it was?
Yeah, so as a candidate, yes, I only had limited resources to deploy, but I was a bootstrap campaign and made the most of what we did. So we really tried to, make sure that our message reached people that had felt the most acute bill increases, and really just sharpened our attention on whether or not residential customers, voters, in other words, were getting a fair shake. And with the influx of data centers and concerns over whether or not they were using up our resources, our electric grid, our water, that was a concern. And I was able to rightly point out that data centers do pay a significantly less price for their electricity vis-a-vis residential customers. And I just simply asked the question, is that a fair shake? And given the recent increases that we had in power prices in Georgia, a lot of folks didn't think that the commissioners we had were looking out for their interests. And I was able to capitalize on that. I think also people trusted the fact that I'm a clean energy expert and have been in this space working and putting my time and
Yeah.
effort into advancing the clean energy economy. So um, all of that came together, and that was very helpful in kind of establishing myself as someone who would do the job and do the job well. And while I didn't have many resources, that message was able to carry, and others were able to pick up that message. And so we had a lot of support, unbeknownst to me, but from others that picked up that message and
Yeah.
carried it out. Just it resonated with the electorate. And in a state like Georgia, that's roughly 50-50, we got 63% of the vote to the other side's 37%. And that means that we carried folks from the other side. They heard the
Yeah.
message power bills were too high and that I could do something about it. So everyone pays a power bill, and it's a cross-cutting message. And with few resources, finding things that are universal messages that helped carry the day.
So the next question is kind of twofold, but being who you are with your background, and then my complaint with Democrats is always we are like we get way too in the weeds on policy, on points. It's like we know so much, but we don't know how to condense it. And you clearly knew how to condense that message from your door knocking and speaking with voters, and you were able to frame what was going on into a simple message. What was that like 30 to 60-second message that got people hooked in that first few seconds of meeting them, that really got their attention if they had no idea what the Public Service Commission was before they met you?
Sure. Well, I'd begin by just again reiterating that the Public Service Commission is the little known but very important five-member body, statewide elected, that regulates how much you pay on your power bill if you're a Georgia Power Company customer, or your gas bill, and then where that energy comes from, whether it
Yep.
comes from clean energy resources or fossil fuel resources. And then I quickly pivot and say, And in the last few years, we've seen a number of increases on your bill. And the reason for that is the commission that we have, and the solution is a clean energy expert. And it is a challenge to take the technical side of an electrical grid and the markets that go behind that and condense it down into something. But it is easier to just say, are you frustrated with your power bill, and would you like to see someone who can do something about it? Just condense it down into the simple terms, and then show up, show an interest in meeting voters where they are and talking about what they're concerned about, their power bills, data centers, things of that
Hmm.
nature. And point out that we can have nicer things in Georgia and in the Southeast, and show where we're already deploying these technologies and great solutions elsewhere. And it's helping with power bills. So I just really would made the case in those 30 or 60 seconds, or however much time I would have, to say, to channel a little bit of that frustration for high power bills and say that the solution is the guy standing right in front of you asking for your vote.
One problem that I think is a very unique Alabama problem, and correct me if I'm wrong saying this, but it's just the Republican chokehold that they have on the state. That people do not realize that Alabama has been a supermajority for as long as it has been, and yet they still want to blame Democrats for certain issues. And when it comes to the Public Service Commission, they have been so effective in burying the commission and not putting information out about it that people obviously don't understand completely what it is. Some people have never heard about it before, but it's been under Republican control. And so it's almost like we're having to, it's a double issue here, because you're trying to inform people that you have a vote for the Public Service Commission and that directly relates to your bills. But Republicans have had control of the commission for X amount of years, and if they wanted to do something about it, they would. Did you have that problem with voters and getting that message across to people in Georgia, or were people already primed that some things transcend party politics and the right thing to do in this case would be to flip a seat?
I think it was a clear-cut case that the incumbent power company was taking advantage of whatever they asked for, they would get. And we saw that time and again. We in Georgia were promised 60 to 80 years of downward pressure on rates once the two new nuclear units came online. And instead, what happened
Mm.
was a permanent 25% increase in base rates. And so, you can only hear promises that are broken later on so many times before you become suspicious. And so I was able to channel that. The six rate increases certainly primed the pump for people to seek change, and I think just a lack of accountability and people focused on doing the work of a regulator, being a shield against imprudent spending,
Yeah.
and and just shifting costs and risks onto residential customers like you and I. So I think that all of that lack of accountability, that frustration, all of that just was fertile ground. And I think that there are more areas in the Southeast like that. And I think there's something like 10 states where public service commissioners are elected. 9 of those states, I believe, have elections. And so energy affordability is very much going to be in the conversation, and it should be in Alabama just as it was in Georgia, because we can't keep doing business as usual. We need to focus on what will lower costs for consumers, because it's just getting harder and harder to get by, and we can do things about it, but we need to be proactive. And we were mentioning briefly, there's legislation out there that Alabama is considering, that might you know kind of take away some of that accountability from the Alabama Public Service Commission. If there is voting by district, then you can manipulate those district boundaries. If it's a
Yeah.
state, then you can't gerrymander a whole state. So I'm worried about attempts to take away accountability in the
Yep.
Southeast, and I think that's a sign that there's change needed, and people recognize that they're just trying to kind of pull up the drawbridge and shore up their defenses and keep the system that we have.
Yeah, there are the Alabama Power. political donations through their PAC, like it knows no bounds. Democrats and Republicans alike take their campaign donations in the state. When you look at who's funded by them, it crosses party lines, and it is just so shocking to me that that's the case. And when you look at the district system, I think one thing that appealed to the Democrats in the legislature was we might not have control of the Public Service Commission, but we can get 2 Democrats on the commission, so we're gonna support this legislation. It's like that should not be the way that we're looking at this. It's not about just having 2 Democrats on the Public Service Commission and you're just handing over control back to Alabama Power for years to come. Like, we should actually try to make positive change right now. And that's one thing I'm trying to get people to understand is you really have to look at who's accepting money from where, because it's not just a red and blue situation. It is so deep. They haven't had an audit since 1982. They have been running wild in this state, and it's time to rein it in. And any effort to prevent that from happening, prevent them from opening their books, is them taking accountability away from the people in Alabama. It is so insane to me. I get DMs from people all the time whenever I make a video talking about electric bills and Alabama Power and the legislation going on. And I kid you not, I have hundreds of screenshots of bills from people saying I live in a 2-bed, 2-bath apartment and their bill is a little less than or the same amount as their rent. And in a few cases, their power bill was more than their rent or their mortgage. And that had my jaw was on the floor, that is the situation that we're in, that people are spending that much money on their electric bills and there's no way to actually fight back right now other than these campaigns and supporting candidates who are trying to hold them accountable. It is wild to me that this is the situation that we're finding ourselves in.
I think that the incumbent utilities are giving political donations to appointees and electeds. They're doing it because they can get away with it, because no one calls them out on it, or if they do, there is no consequences to that. And there are now, at least in Georgia, if you accept donations from those that have business before your commission, then there's a political cost to pay for that. We saw that last November. And just buyer beware. If you accept donations from those that you're meant to regulate, then that's not a good way of doing business. And we get bad outcomes as a result. So it's another form of accountability. That's why, I like the idea of a rate case. When you shine sunshine on a problem, it's a great form of disinfectant. And we should be looking at rates and making sure that they're just and reasonable, that those who are causing those increases in power bills are justly paying for them. It's very frustrating to a person renter, homeowner, who is using the same amount of energy that they've always used, and yet their bill is now 2 or 3 times as high, approaching car payments or mortgage payments. Like you were, that is wild. We have a kind of definition of 6% of your income. If it goes to energy and utility bills, then that's the unaffordability line. And there are people that are paying far more than that, especially those on fixed incomes. They're doing what they've always done, and yet their bills are going up, and they don't understand why. And that's where a rate case can be really helpful, is to examine who's causing those bills to go up, and are they paying their fair share.
I think this would be such a special opportunity to hear from an actual public service commissioner the importance of a rate case. People in Alabama, a lot of my audience, I've been trying to educate them on what a rate case is and why it's important. But from your standpoint, from sitting on a public service commission, why is a rate case so important? What comes out from a rate case? What are you looking at when the books are open during that process?
Yeah, big picture, what a rate case is you look over a forecasted period of time, say 3 years, and look at the total cost to produce all of the electricity that you need to serve all the load that's there in the state, all the generation resources, the power plants, all the transmission lines, the big cables that connect them together, and then all the distribution lines to bring that high voltage energy down to the voltage that comes out of your wall, that 115 volt receptacle. All of that costs a lot of money. And so there's a projection over the next 3 years or so of what that will cost, and then who causes those costs. by looking at how people use energy. And we traditionally build the grid towards the peak hours, usually in the summer, but now increasingly in cold winter mornings, when everyone is getting home from work and turning on their flat screens and cooking dinner and charging their EVs, or waking up in the winter and turning on the heat and taking showers and things like that. So we build towards that peak, and then we basically decide who's causing the need for all of those resources, and that's one bucket, is the whole system, and how do we allocate that. And then there's also the cost to actually operate the system, and different people have different cost causations there. It's very complicated stuff. I mean, you have to go to school, if, as it were, for a long time to kind of get this. But that's what goes into it, is what's the overall cost and who's causing those costs. And then from all of that, you come up with the rates that people pay on their power bills. And what often happens in a rate case is the big energy users that can afford a fancy lawyer, that they'll have representation before the commission in a rate case, and so they always get the best deals because they have very forceful arguments. And part of the reason why I started going down to the Georgia Public Service Commission is because I didn't see a kind of a deep well of analysis to support residential rates and them getting a fair shake. And so it's a balance of who pays what. You've got the big, heavy industrial users that kind of use energy in a very efficient way, a big chunk of meaty energy consumption, and that's easy to pay for, versus residential customers that, aren't using much when they're not home, but when they're home, they like their energy. And so that has a cost. We can be smart about how we use energy, and we can also design rates to encourage people to use energy differently. And that's also part of rate design, is in rate cases, is are there better ways to charge people so that we kind of shift people from using energy during peaks to times when there's a lot of spare capacity on the grid, and thus we can charge a lower rate.
Yeah.
So, you can do things like just charging a much lower rate to charge your EV overnight, and encourage people to do that when there's spare capacity. And that's great. That helps put more money into the grid at lower cost, and then lower everyone's costs when you do that. So rate cases are just big, complicated things where we look at the cost to produce the energy and who causes it, and then we allocate those costs in rates.
When you were educating people about this, when you were running for the Public Service Commission last year, number one, were there oppositions that were being leveraged against your campaign? And if so, what were those? Actually, you know what? That's the first question. I'll save the rest for in a minute. But were there opposition campaigns against your campaign being leveraged against you?
Oh yeah, there was all kinds of spaghetti being thrown at the wall to see what would stick. I was compared to Zoran Mandani as a socialist. There were just, frankly, messages that fell flat, like "Don't California our Georgia," or "Don't dim the lights." Things like, "Hey, don't elect a radical leftist Democrat who will enact a Green New Deal or Green New Scam agendas," they would say. I mean, just nothing of substance. Whereas I just kind of kept my head down and said, I think new data centers should pay their fair share. And I think that all these 6 rate increases, we didn't need to necessarily increase folks' power bills. And furthermore, there's things we can do now to lower folks' power bills. I just kept my head down and did the work, and let just, like a firefighter helmet, water flowing off your back, and just kept moving forward and doing it. So a lot of nonsense, but that to me was an indication that they didn't have, 2 legs to stand on, and it was a sign of weakness, frankly.
That gives me hope. I know that's really weird to say, talking about opposition campaigns, but knowing that they were throwing all these things at the wall, and all those things we're seeing right now in Alabama, we're seeing the public throwing the spaghetti at the wall, ads on news sites that pop up that are in direct opposition to what's being talked about on social media. We see the Californiification of Alabama. Alabama is being bought and owned by California and China. Just all these weird messages that is them panicking and them being worried. And I don't think any of it's sticking. that gives me hope that we're on the right path. There's been personal things that have been happening. I know some of the people who work in the consulting firms employed by Alabama Power, and they filled me in prior to a lot of the content that I was making going as viral as it did in the state. They filled me in on some of the tactics that I could expect, and like clockwork, as the videos popped off, those tactics were being used against me. I talked to other creators who had the same things happening to them. The lengths that they'll go to try to silence opposition is just so insane to me. And that's one reason why I also want a rate case. I want to know how much they're paying these consultant firms, and is that being passed back down onto the customer? I want an answer to that. It's so crazy. And another thing that I wanted to ask you about when it comes to the Public Service Commission in Georgia is, in Alabama, we have all these weird equations and these rates. It's like legalized profits for Alabama Power with our rate stabilization and equalization rate equation that we have. I can't even fully explain it in the detail that it deserves, but essentially it's saying that if they're expecting to have profits, our power bills could be lower, our rates could be lower. If they're expecting a profit loss, our rates could go up, but it's pretty much guaranteeing that they're always going to have a profit. Does Georgia have any weird equations and rate structures like that being operated against the people?
It does. It's a regulatory construct called cost-based regulation. And what happens is, you basically, in that rate case, you take all of the different resources that will cause that are required to generate the electricity, and that goes into, those resources go into what's called a rate base. And there's a lot of complicated things, but basically all the capital expenditures to build new power plants, and the depreciation and the tax credits and all of that stuff flows into it. So it's kind of like a bathtub that fills up and drains out. But there's a pool of money that has been spent called the rate base, and a regulated utility is allowed to earn what's a reasonable rate of return in theory. In Georgia, I don't know exactly what it is in Alabama Power Company's case, but in Georgia, what is approved right now is a band between 9.5 and 11.9% return on equity. So whatever that pool of capital is, then they're allowed to collect on the bills an amount that will fall within that band of 9.5 to 11.9. Now, through some financial wizardry, there's actually a floor of actually 10.5% on Georgia Power Company's return on equity. And if they go above 11.9, then there's some mechanism to share in that as well. So their effective return on equity can actually be quite higher. But the point here is that this is the reason behind a regulated return on equity, is that in theory, this is a natural monopoly. You don't want to build two sets of power plants and wires and all of that. So you grant the monopoly, allow them to make prudent investments, and then they collect a reasonable rate of return on that. That's the deal. What happens in practice is that there's a strong incentive to gold plate things, to build expensive things, to steer towards fossil fuel resources where there's a recurring purchase, where you can benefit on the sale and transportation of the fuel. And so it can work, that model of regulation, if you have regulators who act as a shield against imprudent spending. But when you don't, when they just rubber stamp whatever plan comes across their desk, then that's where this regulated return on equity model, well.
What one thing that I just recently like put the numbers behind and like thought about in an interesting way is how the Southern Company, and this is a point that I have not seen being used, and I'm trying to make people think in this way in the state, but Southern Company has 9 million customers. Alabama Power is 1.5 million of those customers, so about 16% of their customer base is Alabama Power. But yet we account for 35% of their profits. Like, we are a cash cow for the Southern Company. So it makes sense why they are so heavily involved in the legislation that is coming forth in Alabama to try to keep the status quo the same. They don't want change because it affects their profit margins. what does that mean for Southern Company if reform comes to Alabama, the profits go down, power bills go down? What's the overarching fear for Southern Company? What does it mean for them if that happens?
Yeah, it's easy to see why you would spend millions to preserve billions.
Yeah.
What it means is, I mean, they've, as you said, have treated us as cash cows for quite some time, and they've been earning a very healthy return with no risk, effectively. I mean, if you look at where any other investor who goes out into the market and looks for an investment, they are not going to get such a generous deal as a guaranteed return on equity with really no risk, because the regulators always approve whatever plan is put in front of them. And so they've been living high on the hog for a long time. The market, if it were a market-based return on equity, it would be somewhere around 9.5%, somewhere in that range, not the, in Georgia Power Company's case, up to 11.9 or even higher.
Yeah.
And that's a difference of hundreds of millions of dollars, that if we corrected and right-sized what the earnings should be, it would be lower. Now, I don't necessarily think that we should flip the switch overnight, but I think that we can certainly signpost how that should change, and how those really very high profit levels should come down. I mean, I frankly think that, forgetting which state it is, but might be Minnesota, but our public power utilities sorry, our investor-owned utilities are, some of the CEOs are making tens of millions of dollars each year, and our public servants, our
Yeah.
governors, such, they are making nowhere near that level. And we could right size executive compensation. I think that would be a very popular thing to do.
Yeah.
But we've just never pushed back on any of the sort of cash cow implications, and over generous executive compensation and earnings and all of that. And so what that means for Southern Company is just they're going to have to adjust their expectations that the gravy train can't continue forever.
And I read on your campaign website, and this was a while ago, but you were pointing out the fact that Southern Company is owned by shareholders and investment groups. Is that normal? And that's a genuine question. Is that normal across the United States that power companies are owned by investment groups and shareholders? Because it reads to me as a problem, like almost like a conflict of interest, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, I mentioned that the regulated return on equity model can work if you have regulators who do their job and watch the hen house, but not as a fox.
Yeah.
Uh, and it can work well. It's a big mix in the United States. There are a lot of investor-owned utilities, especially in the Southeast. This is a region where most of the rest of the United States, except the West and the Southeast, decided to organize wholesale markets. There's still some investor-owned utilities in those markets, but we do have a lot of utilities, electric utilities, that are based on investor-owned models, where our profits are flowing to shareholders. That's a big portion of it. I don't know the percentage, but there's many, many investor-owned utilities. There are also in Georgia, Alabama, and other places, member-owned electric corporations or
Yep.
cooperatives, and where there isn't a profit motive. And I mean, you can, in places of Georgia, you have neighbors on one side of the street that are Georgia Power Company customers. On the other side, it's the membership corporation, the electric membership corporation. Their bill is half the EMC customer versus
Hmm.
Georgia, because the profit motive isn't there.
Yep.
Then you also have public power like Tennessee Valley Authority or Bonneville Power Administration up in the Pacific Northwest. You have public power there where they don't have the profit motive, but they also sometimes have, make questionable decisions, like TVA building out a
Yep.
bunch of gas generation right now. There isn't a perfect model out there, but I think you can consistently say that having the profit motive in there tends towards higher electric costs and bills.
Yeah, for sure. This next question actually comes from someone else, and I thought it was a good one. And that, because there are a few people who I reached out to when I knew you were coming on the podcast. I wanted to make sure that my thoughts were fully thought out and that all the important points that are happening here in Alabama were being covered. But this question might be a little weird. But I know public service commissioners in states, they talk to other states and they're involved in their groups and what have you. We wanted to know, well, they wanted to know, now we, because now I'm curious, but what is the vibe of Alabama and other states? Like, are we the laughing stock of the energy sector? Like, is it publicly like, are people aware that Alabama is just being raked over the coals and with what's going on?
I don't think so, because that profit motive and the behavior of investor-owned utilities, it isn't specific to Alabama. I mean, we see it in Georgia, we see it in other states as well. Yeah, it might be a little bit more egregious in Alabama.
Oh,
I realize that 16% of SoCo's customers, but a third of their profit. That is very much out of balance. But there's the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, and it's a very helpful association where commissioners from one state can talk to commissioners of another state. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to always be doing novel things. We can use the
yep,
laboratory democracy to see what other states are doing and what works well or doesn't.
yep,
So I don't think Alabama is um, looked down upon in any way. There are regional breakdowns within NARUC, and so all the southern utility commissions get together. In fact, I think the next one is in Mississippi in a few months, but I think it's very congenial. I mean, maybe there's some sympathy about, boy, you've got a bad, but no, I think we recognize that, like, the incentive to maximize shareholder profit isn't unique to Alabama. It just kind of have a bad case of it, I guess.
Yeah, that makes me happy. I'm gonna call them after we get done recording and let them know, hey, we are not the laughing stock. It is not what you think, I promise. But I want to start getting a little tactical as we run out the episode for the voters and candidates running for the Public Service Commission here in Alabama, because I think obviously for a whole slew of reasons, this midterm election is very different from other ones that we've seen. And I know every single election cycle, people say that, but I mean, I really feel it this time, especially as it relates to the state level midterms with the Public Service Commission, people paying attention. Like I said, it's not. I feel like voting for the Public Service Commission is not a political act. It's not drawn by political parties, and so you could see a lot of crossover vote, which could then impact other candidates on the ballot. So I just want to know any advice that you want to give to the candidates and to the voters that they can walk away with, the most single important thing that they need to be aware of as we enter into this election season, and with the Public Service Commission getting as much as attention as it is right now.
I would stay laser focused on energy affordability, on making data centers pay their fair share, and how we have to have uh, thought leaders who are centering ratepayers and customers first, and not just trying to maximize shareholder value to profit to shareholders. Stay focused on energy affordability. Have an answer to what does it mean to you in Alabama to have affordable energy, and how can we get there? Again, there's so many good solutions on the table. What we need to do is have the thought leadership to and the courage to implement them, and also that seat at the table as we began the
Yep.
conversation to actually implement this vision. And if we just stay focused on that message that your costs are going up because we're of the commission that we have and the leaders that we have, and we can change that. And I'd like to be that change. And then just stay focused on that affordability aspect. Stay focused on the fact that data centers they can and are willing to pay their fair share. We simply have to put those conditions in place and ask them to do that. Can't just give away leave money on the table with tax abatements as we're doing in Georgia. I mean, to the tune of $474 million, I think, is the money that was left on the table by providing a tax abatement to data centers that would have come here anyway. So simple messages of that your bills are going up because we have commissioners that are not doing their job, and I want to do that job for you and mind the shop. And are these new large customers paying their fair share? We should make sure that they are, and that can actually help drive down power bills. Staying focused on those simple messages, I think, is probably the winning way to go
Yeah.
here. There is a lot of frustration. People are seeing that that when we have the wrong leaders in place, then energy costs go up. They're seeing that every time they drive by a gas pump and have to fill up. And that's an easy tie-in to, here's how your energy costs are going up. It's a hidden tax. When Hurricane Helene came through Georgia, it again added $912 million is what the storm damage recovery cost that has been filed. That's a hidden tax on your energy bill. So if we are speaking to that and are saying that I hear you when your power bill is too high and I want to bring those solutions to the table, so elect me. I just think it's a compelling message, and it seemed to work in Georgia, and I think it can in Alabama.
Yeah. One thing that I also love to do is level set expectations. I feel like when things are as heated as they are right now and that things are getting as much attention as they're getting, people can have these really grand ideas about what can happen overnight. And as you said, a lot of this change isn't going to happen overnight. And I don't want a Democrat to be elected and then the fact that like a switch isn't flipped is the reason why they're not reelected, or why the progress that they ran on isn't able to happen over a period of time. So I want to level set expectations and understand if a Democrat is elected to the Public Service Commission, if we don't flip it, but we elect a Democrat at minimum, we just flip one seat. What kind of change can we expect to happen over, say, a year or two? Because I know things aren't going to change overnight, but what can change? What can we expect?
Yeah, so that's where a rate case is important, because you can reprioritize who pays what, and you can do that in the short term. I mean, you have to cover your costs. So there's a certain amount of money that has to come in the door, but rate cases allow you to examine is what every customer class is paying. Is it a fair amount? So in the short term, you can do that if you're able to get a rate case. That's why it was in Georgia, there was a rate case freeze last year, and costs still are piling up, but we're just deferring those costs for
Yeah.
3 years by locking them in. But in the longer term, it's critically important to select and build the right resources. When you lock in fossil fuel resources, where you're on that Netflix subscription model and have to keep buying fuel over and over again. When you are building the wrong resources, instead of doing what's low cost like solar, and sharing of resources with neighbors, and using the grid we already have more efficiently. When we embrace those resources, that bends the cost curve down in the long term. And so there's short-term things that we can do if there's a rate case there, but most of the heavy lifting is done in the long term on building the right resources that
Yeah.
will lower costs for everyone.
And I know you kind of already answered this question, but I just want to explicitly ask, do you believe Alabama can do this year what Georgia did last year?
Yes, yes. I think there's a lot of frustration in our leadership, both at the state level and at the federal level. And I think we can channel that and use that to our advantage to say that we can actually have nice things here in the Southeast, but
Yeah.
we just need leaders who have the courage and vision to enact them. And I think it's a great opportunity right now. I think the Southeast is a Moneyball opportunity. We've been doing the wrong thing for a long time. We've been underinvesting in clean energy in a lot of ways. So it's an opportunity to catch up and show some real progress. And so I want to keep doing what I'm doing in Georgia. And I hope that there in Alabama, you recognize the opportunity too, that this is a great moment to be champions and advocates for the consumer. It's been a long time since we've had a seat at the table,
Yeah.
people that will speak up for the common person just trying to get by and pay their power bill without it looking like a mortgage payment.
Peter, I can't express to you enough how you are seen as a celebrity amongst the power circle here in Alabama. In the political circle, everyone keeps mentioning your campaign. They're like, they did it in Georgia. They did it in Georgia. We can do it here. And people keep looking at how you did it, the resources that you had, and they're using that to drive their campaigns. They're using it to drive their messaging. And so I just am so appreciative for the work that you are doing. Hopefully, you can come over to Alabama sometime soon and feel the energy that your campaign and your win has given to this state, the hope that it's given to a lot of people. Um, but with that, I want to ask my final question, and that is, what is it that you're not wrong about?
Well, I'm not wrong about the future of clean energy. And you have to look no further than a very red and oil and gas heavy state like Texas that is embracing solar and wind and batteries with a gusto. It is indisputable that solar is a dominant energy form that is the beauty of it is once you build it, then the pipeline is built right there to the
Yep.
power plant. Fuel's delivered for free every day. Even on a cloudy day, the solar is still producing. Solar fuel does not have to, well, it does transit the Strait of Hormuz, but it can't be blocked by Iran. So it's a brilliant resource that we, especially in the sunny Southeast, should be embracing more. So I'm not wrong about the direction of clean energy, and the world will recognize this. It's just a matter of whether or not we can kind of catch up to where we should be. And I feel very strongly that when we make those right investments, that can bend the cost curve downward. And so that's I think what gives me so much conviction to run for office and to do this work, is I know what works. We
Yeah.
see it in places like Australia where it's very sunny, and now they're offering free electricity for a few hours every afternoon because they just have such an abundance. And it's possible that we could do things like that here in the Southeast. So we're not there yet, but that's why we got to start now. And I think this is a great year to make those investments, to get that seat at the table and start making the change in a positive direction.
You are not wrong about that. I hope that we can see that come to the Southeast and into the greater part of the country here soon. But like I said, you give me so much hope. If it wasn't for you and your campaign, people in Alabama will not be able to see what is possible during this election cycle. So we have a lot to thank you for. And hopefully this can be a continued conversation as we get closer to the election. But I just thank you so much for taking the time to join me on He's Not Wrong today. And I know the audience is going to appreciate this as well. Hi.
And do you want to say hi very quickly?
Hi.
Hi. I also have a 4-year-old to make sure she has a good future as well. Sure.
Yes.
All
Peter,
right. Well,
thank
much.
you so
Yeah.
much.
We'll definitely talk again. I really appreciate it.